When a billionaire offers you a marriage contract to save your daughter's future, you say yes. When the world calls you a gold digger, you stay silent. But when the woman you've come to love questions your integrity, that's when you walk away. Because some men aren't built to beg for belief. They're built to prove their worth through action alone. If you want to see how a single father rewrites the rules of power without losing his soul, stay with me until the end of this story. And when you do, hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel. The rain drummed against the floor-to-ceiling windows of Victoria Hale's corner office, like impatient fingers tapping for attention. Ethan Moore stood just inside the doorway, his daughter's lunch order still pulled up on his phone screen, finger hovering over the submit button for her school cafeteria account. He'd been summoned mid-task, which wasn't unusual. What was unusual was the way Victoria was looking at him, not through him as she typically did, but directly at him, as if seeing him for the first time. "Close the door," she said. Ethan pocketed his phone and complied, his movements economical and quiet. 6 years of single fatherhood had taught him efficiency. 6 months as Victoria Hale's executive secretary had taught him invisibility. He'd perfected both. Victoria stood with her back to the window, the gray Seattle skyline bleeding into the storm behind her. She was 42, sharp-featured, with dark hair pulled into a knot so tight it looked painful. Her suit probably cost more than Ethan's monthly rent. Everything about her communicated control, from her posture to the way she held her champagne flute at exactly the same angle every morning at 11. Except today, her hand trembled slightly. "I need you to marry me," she said. Ethan blinked. Once. Twice. His brain struggled to process the words in order, as if they'd been spoken in a foreign language. "I'm sorry?" "You heard me correctly." Victoria set down her glass with a sharp click against the marble desk. "I need a husband, temporarily. You need financial security. I'm proposing a business arrangement." The floor seemed to tilt beneath Ethan's feet. He'd fielded strange requests before. Victoria once had him source a specific vintage of wine at 3 in the morning for a meeting that never happened. But this existed in an entirely different universe of strange. "Ms. Hale, I don't understand. My ex-husband is getting remarried." Her voice was flat, controlled, but something flickered behind her eyes. "To a 26-year-old yoga instructor he met 4 months ago. The press is having a field day with it. The narrative is that I'm the cold, calculating businesswoman who drove him away, and he's the poor man who finally found warmth and authenticity." Ethan remained silent. He'd learned early that Victoria didn't actually want responses during these moments. She wanted an audience. "The board is concerned," she continued. "Not officially, of course. But there's been talk. Whispers that I'm too isolated, too disconnected from human concerns to lead a company that deals in family investment portfolios. It's absurd, but perception is everything in this business." "And you think marrying your secretary will improve that perception?" The words came out before Ethan could stop them. Victoria's lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "I think marrying a devoted single father who's worked his way up from nothing will show a human side the board didn't know I had. I think having a husband who isn't another shark in a suit will soften my image without diminishing my authority. And I think the optics of genuine partnership, even fabricated partnership, will silence the vultures currently circling my position." Ethan's mind raced. His daughter Sophie needed new shoes. Her asthma medication wasn't fully covered by his insurance. The washing machine in their apartment had been making an ominous grinding sound for 3 weeks. He worked 60-hour weeks and still juggled bills like a circus act, deciding each month which ones could be paid late without catastrophic consequences. But this wasn't about buying a lottery ticket or taking a calculated risk. This was about stepping into a role designed to deceive, to perform, to pretend. What exactly would this arrangement entail? He heard himself ask. Victoria moved to her desk, pulled open a drawer, and extracted a document that looked like it had been prepared by a team of lawyers. Because, of course, it had been. 6 months, minimum. 1 year, maximum. You'd move into my estate. There's a guest house that would be suitable for you and your daughter. You'd attend public functions with me, present as my husband at business events, and maintain the appearance of a genuine relationship. In exchange, I'll pay off your student loans, establish a trust fund for your daughter's education, and provide a lump sum of $200,000 upon successful completion of the contract. The number hit Ethan like a physical blow. $200,000. Sophie's entire future, secured. College, paid for. The crushing weight of debt that had sat on his chest since his ex-wife left, gone. There are conditions, Victoria continued, her tone businesslike now, more comfortable. Complete discretion. No disclosure of the arrangement to anyone, including family. Professional conduct at all times. And should either party wish to terminate early, there are financial penalties outlined in Section 7. She slid the document across the desk. Ethan didn't reach for it. My daughter can't know this is fake. Victoria raised an eyebrow. Excuse me? Sophie is 6 years old. She's been through enough. Her mother walking out, the instability, watching me work myself to exhaustion just to keep us afloat. His voice was steady, but his hands had curled into fists at his sides. If I do this, she has to believe it's real. No confusion, no mixed messages, no adult complications bleeding into her world. That's non-negotiable. For a long moment, Victoria simply stared at him. Ethan had the distinct impression he was being recalibrated in her assessment, shifted from one category to another. Agreed, she finally said. Anything else? I need to think about it. You have until Monday. The engagement announcement is scheduled for next week. Victoria turned back to the window, a clear dismissal. That will be all, Mr. Moore. Ethan picked up the contract with hands that didn't shake. He wouldn't allow them to, and left the office. The hallway felt too bright, too normal, as if the entire world should have shifted on its axis to match the seismic change in his own life. He made it back to his desk, sat down, and stared at the document without seeing it. Around him, the executive floor hummed with its usual controlled chaos. Phones ringing, keyboards clicking, the low murmur of deals being made and fortunes being shifted. His phone buzzed. A text from Sophie's school. Parent-teacher conference requested. Sophie has been withdrawn in class. Please schedule at your earliest convenience. Ethan closed his eyes. Withdrawn. Of course she was. 6 years old and already learning to make herself small, to not ask for things, to understand that Daddy was tired, and money was tight, and life was hard. She'd stopped talking about birthday parties months ago, stopped mentioning the art classes her friend Emma took, stopped being a kid who dreamed big because she'd learned too young that dreams cost money. He opened the contract and began to read. The apartment was dark when Ethan got home at 8:30. He'd stayed late to finish Victoria's correspondence, a task that felt surreal given the morning's conversation. The marriage proposal sat in his briefcase like a live grenade. Daddy! Sophie appeared from her bedroom, still in her school clothes, her brown hair a tangled mess around her face. She crashed into his legs with the full-body enthusiasm only a 6-year-old could muster. Ethan dropped his briefcase and scooped her up, breathing in the scent of her strawberry shampoo and playground dirt. Hey, baby, did Mrs. Chen feed you dinner? Mrs. Chen was their elderly neighbor who watched Sophie after school for a price Ethan could barely afford and she probably didn't need. She did it, he suspected, because she was lonely and Sophie was charming, and some people still believed in helping their neighbors. Spaghetti, Sophie announced, with the sauce from a jar, not the fancy kind you make. The fancy kind is just jar sauce with oregano, Ethan said, setting her down. You brush your teeth yet? Sophie's guilty expression was answer enough. Go, I'll check your homework after. She scampered off, and Ethan moved through the apartment's small kitchen, noting the dishes Mrs. Chen had washed and left in the drying rack, the bills stacked neatly on the counter that he'd have to face tomorrow. The washing machine grinding sound was louder now, definitely dying. His phone buzzed again. This time, a message from an unknown number. This is Victoria Hale. I'm sending a car for you tomorrow at 10 a.m. We need to discuss the particulars if you're seriously considering this. Bring your daughter. She should see the estate. Ethan stared at the message. He hadn't said yes, hadn't said anything, really, except that he needed time to think. But Victoria Hale didn't send cars and extend invitations to people who were going to say no. She'd already decided. The only question was whether Ethan would make the same decision. Sophie returned, toothbrush hanging from her mouth, speaking around it in that way he'd told her 100 times not to. Daddy, Emma's going to Disneyland for spring break. Can we go somewhere? Ethan's heart cracked. Brush properly, Soph. No talking. She disappeared again, and Ethan pulled out his laptop, Googling Victoria Hale's estate before he could talk himself out of it. The photos that came up showed a sprawling property north of Seattle, modern architecture, glass and steel, and carefully manicured grounds. The guest house alone was probably bigger than their entire apartment. Sophie could have a yard. A real bedroom. Space to be loud and messy and six. He closed the laptop before he could think too hard about what he was considering. The car that arrived at 10 the next morning was a Mercedes, black and gleaming, driven by a man in a suit who introduced himself simply as Marcus and handled Sophie's excited questions with the patience of someone used to children. Ethan had dressed them both carefully, his one good suit, Sophie in a dress she usually reserved for school photos. The drive took 40 minutes, winding north through increasingly exclusive neighborhoods until they turned onto a private road that led to gates that opened automatically at their approach. Sophie pressed her face to the window, her breath fogging the glass. Daddy? Is this a castle? Not quite, baby, but it might as well have been. The main house rose before them, all clean lines and massive windows that reflected the gray sky. The grounds stretched in every direction, actual grounds, with gardens and paths and what looked like a small pond in the distance. Victoria met them at the entrance, dressed more casually than Ethan had ever seen her in tailored slacks and a cream sweater that probably still cost more than his monthly salary. Her expression softened slightly when she saw Sophie. You must be Sophie, she said, crouching down to the little girl's eye level. I'm Victoria. Your dad works with me. Sophie, usually shy with strangers, studied Victoria with solemn intensity. You have a big house. I do. Would you like to see the guest house? It has a swing set in the yard. Sophie's eyes went wide, and she looked up at Ethan for permission. He nodded, his throat tight, and watched his daughter's hand slip into Victoria's with a trust he wasn't sure he felt himself. They walked the property, Victoria pointing out features with the same business-like efficiency she brought to investor meetings. The guest house was a small mansion in its own right, 3 bedrooms, modern kitchen, living room with vaulted ceilings. Sophie ran from room to room, her footsteps echoing, her laughter bouncing off walls that had probably never heard a child's joy. The master has an ensuite, Victoria was saying to Ethan as they stood in what would be his bedroom. And the room at the end of the hall gets excellent light. I thought it might work for Sophie. Ethan walked to the window. From here, he could see the swing set Victoria had mentioned, and beyond it, the pond, and beyond that, the main house where Victoria lived her carefully constructed life. Why me? He asked quietly. Victoria was silent for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice had lost some of its polished edge. Because you're real. Because when the press digs into your background, they'll find a man who's worked for everything he has, who's devoted to his child, who has no scandals or skeletons or agenda. You're exactly what I need to appear more human. She paused. And because you're the only person in my life who's never asked me for anything. I'm asking now. No, Victoria said. I'm offering. There's a difference. Sophie's running footsteps echoed from downstairs, followed by her voice calling for Ethan to come see the kitchen. It has 2 ovens. Daddy, 2. She'd be happy here, Victoria observed. It was the most manipulative thing she could have said, and also the truest. Ethan watched his daughter through the window as she emerged into the backyard, running toward the swing set with abandon. I have conditions, he said. Victoria's expression sharpened with interest. Name them. Sophie believes this is real. No slip-ups, no adult conversations she might overhear, no moments where the facade drops around her. Agreed. I keep my job. I don't become your dependent. I work. I contribute. I maintain my own identity. You'd be working for me either way, but I can arrange for additional responsibilities if you prefer not to be seen as purely ornamental. I want final say over what events Sophie attends. If something feels inappropriate for her age, we don't bring her. Reasonable. Ethan turned to face Victoria fully. And when this ends, we do it in a way that doesn't damage her. No sudden disappearance, no ugly public split. We tell her we tried, it didn't work, but we're still friends. We prioritize her emotional well-being over optics. Victoria's expression was unreadable. You're asking me to care about a child I barely know. I'm asking you to be human enough to not traumatize her for your convenience. The silence stretched between them, taut as a wire. Downstairs, Sophie was singing something off-key, her voice drifting up through the expensive architecture. All right, Victoria said finally. Your terms are acceptable. I'll have my lawyers revise the contract. She extended her hand. Do we have an agreement, mister? More? Ethan looked at her hand, then out the window at his daughter, then back at Victoria. He thought about late nights choosing between electricity and groceries, about Sophie's withdrawn expression in class, about the dreams she'd stopped voicing because she'd learned they were impossible. He thought about integrity and survival and the lies we tell ourselves about where the line between them falls. He shook Victoria's hand. We have an agreement. The next 2 weeks moved with the terrible speed of an avalanche. Contracts were signed, lawyers consulted, arrangements made. Ethan gave notice on their apartment with a sick feeling in his stomach, packed up their modest life into boxes that looked even more pathetic in the guest house's spacious rooms. Sophie adapted with the resilience of children, treating the move like an adventure. She named the fish in the pond, all of them, even though they looked identical, and claimed the swing set as her personal domain. She started calling the guest house our new home within 3 days. Ethan's coworkers noticed the change immediately, of course. He'd moved from a studio apartment to an estate. Tongues wagged. Speculation ran rampant through the office like wildfire. It was Danielle from accounting who finally cornered him in the break room on his 4th day of living on Victoria's property. She was in her 50s, had been with the company for 20 years, and had a tendency to speak her mind regardless of hierarchy. So, she said, pouring coffee with deliberate slowness. You and the Ice Queen. That's unexpected. Ethan focused on his own cup. Victoria prefers Ms. Hale. I'm sure she does. Doesn't answer my question, though. We've been seeing each other privately for a few months. The lie came easier than he'd expected. They'd rehearsed it, him and Victoria, sitting in her office after hours, building a narrative that would withstand scrutiny. We wanted to be sure before making it public. Danielle's eyebrows rose. A few months? She's barely said 3 personal words to you in the 6 months you've worked here. She's private about her personal life. Private is one thing. This is... Danielle shook her head. Look, I'm not judging, but people are talking, Ethan. They're saying you moved fast, that you saw an opportunity and took it. The implication hung in the air between them, ugly and clear. Let them talk, Ethan said quietly. I know what my intentions are. So does Victoria. That's what matters. Danielle studied him for a long moment, her expression softening slightly. You're a good dad, Ethan. Everyone knows that. Just make sure you're not sacrificing your integrity for security. That trade never works out the way you think it will. She left him standing in the break room, her words echoing in his head like a prophecy. That evening, Victoria called him to the main house for dinner. Their first as an engaged couple, she said, though her tone suggested she found the phrase vaguely distasteful. Ethan left Sophie with Marcus, who'd revealed an unexpected talent for princess-themed coloring books, and crossed the grounds to the main house with his shoulders squared. Victoria's home was as controlled as her office. Modern furniture, expensive art that probably had meaning Ethan didn't understand. Everything in shades of white and gray and cold blue. She'd set the dining room table herself, he noticed, which somehow felt more intimate than if she'd had staff do it. Wine? She offered, already pouring before he could answer. They sat across from each other at a table designed to seat 12. The silence felt weighted, expectant. The engagement party is scheduled for next Friday, Victoria said, cutting into her salmon with surgical precision. The guest list is mostly board members, a few key investors, some press. You'll need to be prepared. Prepared how? To be scrutinized, questioned, judged. She met his eyes. They'll want to know how we met, how long we've been together, what your intentions are. They'll be looking for any crack in the story, any sign this is exactly what it is, a strategic arrangement. So we stick to the narrative. We met through work, started talking during late nights at the office, discovered we had more in common than we expected. And your daughter? Ethan set down his fork. Sophie believes you make me happy. She's excited about the wedding because she thinks it means we're becoming a family. She's 6. Her version of the story is pure and uncomplicated, and I'd like to keep it that way. Victoria's expression flickered with something that might have been discomfort. You understand that she'll eventually realize the truth. When she's older, when she can understand nuance and complexity and the choices adults make for survival. Ethan's voice was harder than he intended. But not now. Not while she's young enough to believe in fairy tales. Is that what you're telling her this is? A fairy tale? I'm telling her that sometimes good things happen to good people. That her dad met someone who makes him smile. That we're lucky. He picked up his wine glass, swirled the contents without drinking. Is that so terrible? To let a child believe in luck for a little while? Victoria was quiet, her gaze steady on him. You're more complicated than I gave you credit for, Mr. Moore. Ethan, if we're engaged, you should probably use my first name. Ethan, then. She tested the name like an unfamiliar flavor. And you should call me Victoria, at least in private. They finished dinner making small talk about the party logistics, what he should wear, who would be there, the general flow of the evening. It was all very professional, very transactional. But when Ethan stood to leave, Victoria walked him to the door, and for just a moment, her careful composure slipped. Thank you, she said quietly, for agreeing to this. I know it's not simple. Ethan thought about Sophie's laughter echoing through the guest house, about the college fund that was now secure, about the weight of debt that had lifted from his shoulders. He thought about Danielle's warning and the lie he was living and the way his daughter's hand had felt in Victoria's. Nothing worth doing ever is, he replied, and stepped out into the night. The engagement party arrived with the inevitability of a storm. Ethan stood in front of the mirror in his new bedroom, their new bedroom technically, though he and Sophie still slept in the guest house, adjusting a tie that cost more than his first car. Victoria had sent over a stylist who'd transformed him from executive secretary to millionaire's fiancé with frightening efficiency. Sophie sat on the bed behind him, already in her pajamas, watching with solemn eyes. You look fancy, Daddy. I feel like I'm playing dress-up, he admitted. Is Victoria going to be there? It's her party, baby. Of course she'll be there. Sophie swung her legs, hitting the bed frame with rhythmic thumps. Do you love her? Ethan's hand stilled on the tie. This was the question he'd been dreading, the one he'd rehearsed answers to in his head but never quite solved. I care about her very much, he said carefully, and I think we can build something good together. That's what matters, right? Building something good? Emma's parents fight all the time, Sophie offered. They throw things. Emma has to sleep with headphones on. Ethan turned to face his daughter, crouching down so they were eye level. Hey, look at me. I will never let that be your life, never. You understand? Whatever happens between me and Victoria, you will always be safe, always be loved. That's my promise to you. Sophie studied him with an intensity that seemed too old for her years. Then she nodded and wrapped her arms around his neck in a hug that squeezed all the air from his lungs. Okay, Daddy, I believe you. Marcus drove him to the main house, where the party was already in full swing. Ethan could see cars lining the circular drive, hear the murmur of conversation and clink of glasses through the open doors. His stomach twisted. Victoria met him in the foyer, and for a moment Ethan forgot how to breathe. She was wearing a dress the color of midnight, simple and elegant, her hair down for once in soft waves around her face. She looked younger, softer, almost vulnerable. You clean up well, she said, her version of a compliment. You look beautiful. The words came out before he could filter them, honest and unpolished. Something shifted in Victoria's expression, surprise maybe, or pleasure. She extended her hand. Ready to face the wolves? Ethan took her hand, feeling the slight tremble in her fingers that belied her calm exterior. As ready as I'll ever be. They entered the party together, and the room seemed to still. Conversations paused mid-sentence, heads turned. Ethan could feel the weight of dozens of eyes assessing him, categorizing him, finding him wanting. Victoria's grip on his hand tightened fractionally. Then she smiled, a real smile, warm and genuine, and led him into the crowd. Everyone, she said, her voice carrying across the room with the authority of someone used to commanding attention. I'd like you to meet Ethan Moore, my fiancé. The murmurs started immediately. Ethan could hear fragments of conversation as Victoria guided him through the crowd, introducing him to board members and investors whose names he'd only heard in meetings. Worked as her secretary. Single father, I heard. Quite the promotion. An older man with silver hair and a suit that screamed old money stepped forward, extending his hand with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Robert Chen, board member. Congratulations on your engagement, Mr. Moore. Ethan shook his hand firmly. Thank you, Mr. Chen. I'm very lucky. Indeed. Tell me, how did you two meet? I wasn't aware Victoria was seeing anyone. It was a test. They all were. Ethan could see it in the way the nearby conversations had quieted, the subtle shift of bodies angling to hear his answer. We met at work, Ethan said easily, the rehearsed narrative rolling off his tongue. I started as Victoria's secretary 6 months ago. We spent a lot of late nights at the office, and somewhere between the coffee runs and the conference calls, we started actually talking. I found out she's funny when she's tired. She found out I make a decent cup of coffee. A few polite chuckles rippled through the listeners. And the engagement? Robert pressed. Seems rather fast. Victoria stepped in smoothly. When you know, you know. I didn't build a multi-billion-dollar company by second-guessing my decisions, Robert. Why should my personal life be any different? The challenge in her voice was clear. Robert's smile tightened, but he backed down with a gracious nod. Of course. My congratulations to you both. They moved through the party, repeating variations of the same conversation a dozen times. Ethan learned to read the room quickly, who was genuinely happy for Victoria, who was skeptical, who was already calculating the political implications of her marriage to a former secretary. It was exhausting. He was getting another drink at the bar when a woman in her 30s approached, all sharp angles and calculating eyes. She introduced herself as Jennifer Wright from the Seattle Business Journal. Mr. Moore, can I ask you a few questions for a profile piece I'm writing? Ethan glanced across the room to where Victoria was deep in conversation with a group of investors. She caught his eye and gave the barest nod. Of course, he said. Jennifer pulled out her phone, started recording. You're a single father, correct? Yes. My daughter Sophie is 6. And you work as Ms. Hale's executive secretary? I do. Some people might see this relationship as a significant power imbalance. What would you say to those who suggest you might have ulterior motives? There it was, the question beneath all the polite congratulations, the skeptical looks, the whispered conversations. Gold digger, opportunist, social climber. Ethan set down his drink, met Jennifer's gaze directly. I'd say those people don't know me. They don't know that I've worked 2 jobs since Sophie was born to keep us afloat. They don't know that I put myself through night school while raising a baby on my own. They don't know that the last thing I was looking for when I took this job was a relationship. He paused. But I found one anyway, and I'm not going to apologize for that. I'm not going to apologize for being happy, or for my daughter finally having stability, or for choosing to build a life with someone I respect and care about. Jennifer's expression was unreadable. And Ms. Hale? What does she see in you? Ethan smiled, and it was genuine. You'd have to ask her that. But I hope she sees someone who will stand beside her, not behind her. Someone who sees her as a person, not just a position. Someone who makes her laugh when she's had a long day. That's very romantic, Mr. Moore. Is it? Ethan picked up his drink again. I just call it honest. Jennifer thanked him and melted back into the crowd. Ethan exhaled slowly, realizing his hands were shaking slightly. He'd just done an interview with a journalist about his fake engagement. Victoria appeared at his elbow moments later. You handled that well. Did I? I feel like I just painted a target on my back. You presented yourself as exactly what we need you to be. Genuine, grounded, unaffected by the wealth and status. She touched his arm lightly. That was good, Ethan. Really good. The approval in her voice shouldn't have mattered as much as it did, but Ethan felt it anyway, a small warmth in his chest that had nothing to do with the champagne. The party continued for another 2 hours. Ethan shook hands until his palm ached, smiled until his face hurt, answered the same questions with the same carefully constructed honesty. By the time the last guest left, he was exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with physical tiredness. Victoria walked him to the door, her heels clicking on the marble floor. They stood in the foyer, the house suddenly too quiet after all the noise. "You did well tonight," she said. "Better than I expected, honestly." "Is that a compliment?" "From me?" "Yes." She tilted her head, studying him. "You surprised me, Ethan Moore. Most people in your position would have tried too hard, would have overcompensated or been obsequious or made it clear they were out of their depth. But you just were yourself, comfortable in your own skin, even surrounded by people who were measuring you for failure." Ethan shrugged. "I learned a long time ago that I can't control what people think of me. I can only control who I actually am. The rest is just noise." Victoria's expression softened into something that looked almost like respect. "That's a hard lesson to learn. Most people never do. Most people didn't raise a daughter alone while working their way through school and trying to survive on minimum wage." Ethan smiled tiredly. "You develop perspective pretty quickly when your choices are dignity or despair." They stood in silence for a moment, the weight of the evening settling around them like dust. "Thank you," Victoria said quietly, "for doing this, for being what I needed tonight." "Just keeping up my end of the contract," Ethan replied, but there was no bite in it. He walked back to the guest house under a sky full of stars, his tie loosened, his shoulders heavy. Inside, Mrs. Chen was asleep on the couch, and Sophie was curled up in her bed, clutching the stuffed elephant she'd had since she was a baby. Ethan stood in her doorway watching her sleep and wondered what price he'd eventually pay for the safety he'd bought her tonight. Whatever it was, he thought, it would be worth it. It had to be. The morning after the engagement party, Ethan woke to Sophie jumping on his bed at 6:30, already dressed in her school uniform and vibrating with excitement. "Daddy! Daddy! Mrs. Chen said there's pictures of you and Victoria on the computer. Can we look?" Ethan groaned, pulling a pillow over his face. His head throbbed from too much champagne and too little sleep. "It's Saturday, Soph. No school. Why are you awake?" "Because it's exciting." She tugged the pillow away, her face flushed with joy. "You're going to be married, and we get to live here forever, and I can swing every day." The pure happiness in her voice cut through Ethan's exhaustion. He pulled her down into a hug, breathing in her little kid smell of syrup and sleep. "Forever's a long time, baby." "That's the best part." She wriggled free and grabbed his hand. "Come on, come see the pictures." Mrs. Chen had indeed pulled up the Seattle Business Journal's website on Ethan's laptop, and there they were, photos from the party, Victoria's hand in his, both of them smiling like people who had every right to be happy. The headline read, "Ice Queen melts? Victoria Hale announces engagement to executive secretary." Ethan's jaw tightened. Ice Queen. They couldn't even give her a genuine moment without reducing her to a cruel nickname. "You look like a prince," Sophie announced, pointing at a photo of Ethan in his borrowed suit. "And Victoria looks like a princess. A grown-up princess." Mrs. Chen appeared in the doorway with coffee, her expression carefully neutral. "The article is mostly kind," she said quietly, in the tone that meant it absolutely wasn't. "But the comments, I don't need to read the comments. Probably wise." She handed him the coffee. "Sophie, why don't you go pick out a book for your father to read to you? Give him a moment to wake up." Sophie scampered off, and Mrs. Chen's voice dropped lower. "They're calling you names, Ethan, saying terrible things about your intentions. About Sophie. One person even suggested you were using your daughter to manipulate Ms. Hale." The coffee turned bitter in Ethan's mouth. "People always need someone to look down on. Makes them feel better about their own lives." "That doesn't make it right." "No," Ethan agreed, "but it makes it predictable." His phone buzzed with a text from Victoria. "Board meeting Monday at 9. You should attend. Time to show them you're more than decorative." Ethan stared at the message. Board meetings were senior executive territory, not secretary level. Certainly not fiancé as accessory level. He texted back, "What's the agenda?" "Investment portfolio review for the Redmond tech sector. Should be straightforward. Wear the gray suit." Ethan had exactly one gray suit, and Victoria knew it. The casualness of her instruction felt intentional, a reminder that she controlled the parameters of their arrangement even as she invited him deeper into her world. Sophie returned with 3 books instead of 1, because she'd never met a rule she couldn't creatively reinterpret, and Ethan spent the next hour reading about talking animals and brave children and happy endings that always seemed to involve everyone learning to be kind. He wished real life worked that way. Monday morning arrived with gray skies and the kind of drizzle that Seattle specialized in. Not quite rain, not quite mist, just persistent dampness that seeped into everything. Ethan dressed carefully in his gray suit, checked his reflection 3 times, and still felt like an imposter. Sophie grabbed his hand as he prepared to leave for the main house. "You look smart, Daddy, like you could solve really hard math problems." "Board meetings aren't about math, baby." "Then what are they about?" Ethan crouched down, adjusting her backpack straps. "They're about people with money deciding how to make more money and trying to convince each other they're the smartest person in the room." "Are you the smartest person in the room?" The question, asked with such innocent confidence, made Ethan's throat tight. "No, but I'm going to try to be useful anyway." "That's better than being smart," Sophie announced with the certainty of someone who'd been told this many times. "You told me that, remember? When I was sad about the spelling test?" Ethan had indeed told her that during one of her early struggles at the new school when she'd come home in tears because the other kids seemed to know everything already. He'd said that being kind and working hard mattered more than being the smartest, and she'd believed him because 6-year-olds still believed their fathers knew the truth about the world. He kissed her forehead. "I remember. Now go brush your teeth again. I can smell the syrup from here." The boardroom was on the executive floor, a space Ethan had walked past 100 times but never entered. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the Seattle skyline. A long mahogany table dominated the center, and the chairs probably cost more than most people's cars. Victoria was already there, reviewing documents with the focused intensity she brought to everything. She looked up when Ethan entered, her expression briefly warming before returning to professional neutrality. "Ethan, sit here." She indicated the chair to her right, the position traditionally reserved for a COO or trusted advisor. Every head in the room turned. Ethan recognized most of them from the engagement party: Robert Chen, the silver-haired skeptic; Martha Dawson, who controlled 3 seats on the board; David Park, young and ambitious and clearly annoyed by Ethan's presence. "Good morning," Ethan said evenly, taking his seat. Robert Chen's smile was thin. "Mr. Moore, I wasn't aware you'd be joining us for portfolio reviews. These meetings are typically limited to senior executives and board members." "Ethan is family now," Victoria said without looking up from her documents, "and I value his perspective. Shall we begin?" The meeting proceeded with the kind of corporate efficiency Ethan had observed from the outside but never participated in. Charts were presented, projections analyzed, investments debated. Ethan stayed quiet, absorbing information, noting the power dynamics at play, who deferred to whom, who challenged Victoria directly, who saved their objections for strategic moments. 40 minutes in, the conversation turned to a proposed investment in a Redmond-based tech startup focused on affordable housing solutions through modular construction. David Park was presenting, his voice confident as he outlined the opportunity. The founders are Stanford grads, solid pedigree, and they're projecting 15% returns within 3 years. The affordable housing market is exploding, and the founders are 26 years old with no construction experience, Ethan said quietly. The room went silent. Every eye turned to him. David's expression hardened. "I'm sorry, did you have something to add?" Ethan met his gaze steadily. "I'm saying their projections are optimistic to the point of fantasy. Modular construction in Washington state requires navigating union contracts, permitting processes that can take years, and environmental regulations that add 30 to 40% to initial cost estimates. Their 3-year timeline assumes none of those obstacles exist." "And you know this how?" Robert Chen asked, his tone sharp. "Because I've lived in affordable housing my entire adult life. I've watched developers make promises about fast, cheap construction and then disappear when they hit their first regulatory hurdle." Ethan pulled out his phone, pulled up a document he'd reviewed over the weekend when he couldn't sleep. I took the liberty of researching their permit applications. They filed for preliminary approval 8 months ago and haven't cleared the first round of environmental review. At their current pace, they won't break ground for at least another year, which pushes your return timeline to 4 or 5 years minimum, assuming everything goes perfectly from here. Victoria's expression remained neutral, but Ethan caught the slight lift of her eyebrow. Approval or surprise, he couldn't tell. David's face had gone red. With all due respect, Mr. Moore, investment analysis requires more than personal anecdotes about housing struggles. You're right, Ethan agreed. It requires understanding the ground-level realities that optimistic business plans tend to ignore. These founders have never dealt with a union strike, or a delayed inspection, or a community board that doesn't want modular housing in their backyard. But those things will happen. They always do. And when they do, your 15% return becomes a 3% loss. Martha Dawson leaned forward, her sharp eyes fixed on Ethan. What would you recommend instead? Ethan hesitated. This was beyond his role, beyond what he'd been brought here to do. But Victoria's slight nod was permission. There's a company in Tacoma, smaller, founded by a woman who's been in construction for 20 years. She's working on the same modular concept, but with realistic timelines and existing union partnerships. Her projections are conservative, 8% over 5 years. But she's already cleared permits on 3 projects and has a waiting list of municipalities interested in her designs. Who's the company? Martha asked. Cascade Modular. The founder is Maria Santos. Martha made a note. David looked like he wanted to argue but couldn't find solid ground. Robert Chen's expression had shifted from hostile to calculating. Victoria closed the folder in front of her with a decisive snap. David, table your proposal for now. Do additional due diligence on the timeline concerns Ethan raised. Martha, can you pull the information on Cascade Modular for our next meeting? Already on it, Martha said, still writing. The meeting continued, but something had shifted. Ethan noticed Robert Chen watching him with new interest. Martha asked his opinion on 2 other proposals, listening carefully to his responses. Even David, still smarting from the public contradiction, couldn't entirely dismiss the validity of Ethan's points. When the meeting finally concluded, Victoria stood smoothly. Ethan, a word in my office. He followed her down the hall, hyper-aware of the whispers starting behind them. Victoria's office door closed with a soft click, and she turned to face him with an expression he couldn't read. That was either very stupid or very brilliant, she said. I'm leaning towards stupid. David Park has been trying to undermine me for 6 months. He brings proposals designed to look good on paper, but that he knows I'll have to reject, making me appear risk-averse to the board. Victoria's lips curved into something predatory. You just did in 5 minutes what I've been trying to do diplomatically for half a year. Expose his due diligence as inadequate. I didn't mean to. Yes, you did. Victoria moved to her desk, poured 2 glasses of water from the pitcher there. You saw an opportunity to prove you belonged in that room as more than my accessory, and you took it. That was the point of bringing you, to see if you would. Ethan accepted the water, his mind racing. This was a test. Everything is a test, Ethan. Surely you've learned that by now. She sipped her water, watching him over the rim. But you passed, impressively. Martha Dawson controls enough board votes to make or break my position as CEO. She respects competence above all else. You just showed her you have it. And David Park? Will hate you, but he already hated the idea of you. At least now he has to take you seriously while he does it. Ethan set down his glass, suddenly exhausted. This is what every day is going to be like, isn't it? Performance and calculation and strategy? Victoria's expression softened slightly. Welcome to my world. Population, mostly sharks. And which one are you? The biggest shark, she said without hesitation. The one who eats the others when they forget to watch their backs. Ethan should have been disturbed by the casual ruthlessness. Instead, he found himself almost admiring it. The clarity of Victoria's self-awareness, the absence of pretense about what her world demanded. His phone buzzed. A text from Sophie's school. Sophie had an incident at recess. Please call. Ethan's stomach dropped. I need to go, Victoria said immediately. Family first. That was our agreement. He was already moving toward the door when her voice stopped him. Ethan, you did well today, really well. I thought you should know that. The approval shouldn't have mattered. It was all part of the performance, the carefully constructed lie they were selling to the world. But it mattered anyway. Sophie's school was a 15-minute drive that Ethan made in 10, his heart hammering the entire way. The principal, Mrs. Richardson, met him in her office with an expression of careful concern that immediately put him on edge. Mr. Moore, thank you for coming so quickly. Sophie is fine physically, but there was an altercation with another student. What kind of altercation? Mrs. Richardson folded her hands on her desk. Another child, Emma, made some comments about your engagement to Ms. Hale, about the circumstances of your relationship. Sophie became upset and pushed Emma off the swing. Ethan's hands curled into fists. What exactly did Emma say? According to witnesses, she told Sophie that her father was a gold digger who was only marrying Ms. Hale for money, that Sophie was poor and her dad was using her to get rich. The words hit like physical blows. Emma was 6 years old. She'd learned those words from adults, probably her parents, probably repeating dinner table conversations about the poor secretary who'd landed the rich boss. Where's Sophie now? In the counselor's office. Mr. Moore, I understand this is a difficult situation, but we have a zero-tolerance policy for physical aggression. Sophie will need to serve detention tomorrow, and we'd like you to speak with her about appropriate ways to handle conflict. Ethan barely heard the rest of Mrs. Richardson's speech about school policies and behavioral expectations. His daughter, his shy, gentle daughter, who cried during sad movies and insisted on saying goodnight to her stuffed animals, had pushed another child because someone had called her father names. Sophie was sitting in a small chair in the counselor's office, her legs swinging, her face blotchy from crying. When she saw Ethan, she burst into fresh tears. I'm sorry, Daddy. I'm sorry. I know I'm not supposed to push, but she said you were bad, and you're not bad. You're the best, Daddy. And I couldn't let her say that. Ethan pulled her into his arms, feeling her small body shake with sobs against his chest. Shh, baby. It's okay. I'm not mad. But I have detention, and Mrs. Richardson said I made bad choices. You did make a bad choice, Ethan said gently, pulling back to look at her face. Pushing isn't okay, even when someone says something mean, but I understand why you did it, and I love you for wanting to defend me. Sophie sniffled. Emma said you're only marrying Victoria for money. That's not true, right? You love her? The question was a knife between his ribs. Ethan looked into his daughter's tear-stained face, at the desperate need for reassurance there, and felt the full weight of the lie he'd agreed to live. I care about Victoria very much, he said carefully. And she cares about us. That's what matters. What Emma said, those are just words from people who don't know us. They don't get to decide who we are or why we make the choices we make. Only we do. But why would she say those things? Because sometimes people need to make others small to feel big themselves. Emma's parents probably said things, and she repeated them without understanding what they meant. Ethan cupped Sophie's face in his hands. But you know the truth. You know that I would never do anything to hurt you or make you ashamed, right? Sophie nodded slowly. Right. Good. Now, you're still going to have detention tomorrow, because pushing is not how we solve problems. But when you're done, you and I are going to get ice cream and talk about better ways to handle it when someone says something mean. Can Victoria come? The question surprised him. To get ice cream? Yeah, she never comes to do stuff with us. It's always just you and me. But if she's going to be family, shouldn't she come too? Out of the mouths of babes. Sophie had, with the devastating clarity of childhood, identified exactly what was wrong with their arrangement. They were performing a relationship for the public, but not living one in private. I'll ask her, Ethan promised, knowing Victoria would probably say no, would cite work obligations or prior commitments, or simply the awkwardness of pretending domesticity when they barely knew each other. But when he texted her later that afternoon, explaining what had happened and Sophie's request, Victoria's response surprised him. What time? I'll clear my schedule. They met at a small ice cream shop near the estate at 5 o'clock. Victoria arrived in casual clothes, jeans and a sweater that made her look younger, more approachable. Sophie's eyes went wide. "You look different," she announced with her characteristic bluntness. Victoria's lips quirked. "Different good or different bad?" "Different like a regular person, not like a boss." "I am a regular person, Sophie, just one who happens to run a company." They ordered ice cream. Sophie got chocolate chip with gummy bears. Ethan got coffee. Victoria surprised him by ordering strawberry with hot fudge and sat at a small table by the window. Sophie swung her legs under the chair, working on her cone with single-minded focus. Victoria watched her with an expression Ethan couldn't quite name. "Your dad told me what happened at school," Victoria said carefully. "That must have been upsetting." Sophie's face clouded. "Emma said mean things." "She did, and I'm sorry that you had to hear them, but pushing her wasn't the answer." "That's what Daddy said." "Your dad is right." Victoria set down her spoon, her gaze direct. "Sophie, do you know what I do all day at work?" Sophie shook her head. "I make decisions about money, big decisions that affect a lot of people. And almost every single day, someone disagrees with me. Sometimes they say mean things. Sometimes they try to make me look stupid or weak or like I don't deserve my job." Victoria leaned forward slightly. "If I pushed everyone who said something I didn't like, I'd spend all my time pushing and no time actually doing my work. So what do you do instead?" "I prove them wrong. Not with words, and definitely not with pushing, with actions, with results, with being so good at what I do that their mean words don't matter anymore." Sophie considered this, her cone dripping onto her napkin. "But what if they don't stop being mean?" "Then they don't stop. But that's their problem, not mine. I can't control what other people say or think. I can only control what I do and who I choose to be." Victoria glanced at Ethan, something soft in her expression. "Your dad understands that. It's one of the things I admire about him." Ethan's throat tightened. The words felt too real, too unscripted for their performance. Sophie finished her ice cream in thoughtful silence. When they walked back to the car, she slipped her hand into Victoria's with the easy trust of a child who'd decided someone was safe. Victoria looked down at the small hand in hers with an expression of pure bewilderment, like she'd been handed an artifact from an alien civilization and had no idea what to do with it. Ethan caught her eye over Sophie's head and mouthed, "Just hold it." Victoria did, her grip careful, and together they walked through the parking lot looking for all the world like a real family. That night, after Sophie was asleep, Ethan found himself standing on the guest house porch, unable to settle. His phone buzzed with a message from Victoria. "Thank you for including me today. I haven't had ice cream in years." "Why not? No time. No reason. No one to go with." Ethan stared at the message, at the loneliness implied in those simple words. Victoria Hale, powerful and wealthy, and in control of everything in her world, hadn't had ice cream in years because she had no one to share it with. "Sophie would go with you any time. She thinks you're cool." Cool is not a word typically associated with me. "Maybe you've been hanging around the wrong people." There was a long pause before the next message came through. "Maybe I have." Ethan looked across the grounds toward the main house, where light still burned in what he knew was Victoria's study. He imagined her there, alone with her work, choosing isolation because it was safer than vulnerability. He understood that impulse. He'd lived it himself for years after Sophie's mother left, building walls and calling them boundaries, protecting himself by refusing to let anyone close enough to hurt him. But somewhere in the last few weeks, something had shifted. The performance was starting to feel less like a lie and more like a possibility. And that terrified him more than any amount of public scrutiny ever could. The possibility lingered between them like smoke, invisible but undeniable, coloring every interaction with something neither of them had names for. 3 weeks after the ice cream shop, Ethan found himself attending more meetings, offering more input, being consulted on decisions that had nothing to do with his secretarial duties. Victoria asked his opinion on everything from investment portfolios to the wording of press releases. And somewhere in those consultations, the line between performance and partnership began to blur. The tabloids noticed. Of course they did. Ethan was reviewing quarterly reports in his office when Danielle appeared in his doorway, her expression grim. She held up her phone, showing him a gossip website headline. From Secretary to Strategist, How Ethan Moore is Reshaping Hale Industries from the Inside. The article was accompanied by photos of him leaving board meetings, speaking with investors, sitting beside Victoria at public events. The implication was clear. He was consolidating power, using his relationship to climb higher than any secretary had a right to reach. "They're painting you as Machiavellian," Danielle said quietly. "Like you planned this whole thing from the moment you took the job." Ethan set down his pen with deliberate care. "Do you believe that?" Danielle studied him for a long moment. "No, but it doesn't matter what I believe. It matters what they believe, and right now they believe you're dangerous." "Dangerous to whom?" "To everyone. To Victoria's legacy, to the company's stability, to the natural order of things where secretaries stay secretaries and bosses stay distant." Danielle moved further into the office, closing the door behind her. "Ethan, I'm saying this because I like you, because you're a good father and a decent man. You need to be careful. The higher you rise, the harder they'll try to pull you down, and they won't care who gets hurt in the process." After she left, Ethan pulled up the full article on his computer and read it with growing unease. The writer had clearly done their research, outlining his involvement in recent company decisions, his attendance at high-level meetings, the way Victoria increasingly deferred to his judgment on matters of public perception and market strategy. They'd even found people willing to speak anonymously about the concerning influence of a man with no formal business training shaping multi-million-dollar decisions. His phone rang. Victoria's name on the screen. "Have you seen it?" she asked without preamble. "Just finished reading. My PR team wants to release a statement clarifying your role, emphasizing that all final decisions remain mine." She paused. "I told them no." Ethan frowned. "Why?" "Because clarifying your role means defending it, and defending it means acknowledging their premise that you need defending. It gives credibility to the idea that your influence is somehow inappropriate." Victoria's voice was sharp, controlled. "I won't apologize for consulting my partner on business decisions. I won't diminish your contributions to protect people's comfort with traditional hierarchies. Your board might disagree. The board works for me, not the other way around. And the numbers don't lie. Company performance has improved since you started attending meetings. Client satisfaction is up. We've avoided 3 bad investments and committed to 2 excellent ones, largely because you asked questions no one else thought to ask." Ethan rubbed his temples, feeling the beginning of a headache. "This is going to get worse before it gets better." "Probably," Victoria agreed. "Can you handle that?" It was a genuine question, not a challenge. She was asking if he had the fortitude to withstand increasing scrutiny, escalating criticism, potentially coordinated attacks on his character and competence. Ethan thought about Sophie, secure in her new school, making friends, laughing again. He thought about the college fund that would give her opportunities he'd never had. He thought about the promise he'd made to himself years ago, that he would do whatever it took to give his daughter a better life than he'd had. "I can handle it," he said. "Good. Because I'm going to need you at the Investor Summit in Portland next week. It's our biggest event of the year, and there are whispers that some key investors are reconsidering their commitments based on perceived instability in leadership." "Meaning me?" "Meaning the narrative around us. Around this." Victoria's voice softened slightly. "Ethan, I know this isn't what you signed up for. The contract specified public appearances and maintaining appearances. It didn't specify becoming a lightning rod for every anxious investor who's uncomfortable with change." "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that if you want to step back, scale down your involvement, I'd understand. We can renegotiate the terms, keep the engagement, but reduce your visibility." Ethan stood, pacing his small office. Through the window, he could see the Seattle skyline, gray and imposing. 6 months ago, he'd been invisible in this building, the quiet secretary who kept his head down and his ambitions modest. Now he was a talking point, a controversy, a symbol of everything people love to hate about power and privilege and the appearance of unearned advancement. "No," he said firmly. "I'm not stepping back. If they think I'm influencing company decisions, then I'm going to make damn sure those influences lead to good outcomes. Let them criticize the process all they want, as long as the results speak for themselves." Victoria was quiet for a moment. When she spoke again, something had shifted in her tone. Warmth, maybe, or respect. "You're more resilient than I gave you credit for." I've had a lot of practice. Yes, she said softly. I suppose you have. The Portland Investor Summit was held at a sprawling conference center overlooking the Columbia River. Ethan stood in the hotel room Victoria had booked for him, adjusting his tie for the third time and feeling wholly inadequate for what lay ahead. This wasn't a board meeting with familiar faces. This was 300 investors, analysts, and industry leaders who would all be evaluating him, judging whether Victoria Hale's unprecedented choice of partner indicated brilliant unconventionality or catastrophic judgment. A knock on the connecting door between his room and Victoria's. She entered without waiting for permission, dressed in a navy suit that made her look formidable and untouchable. "Stop fidgeting," she said, crossing the room to fix his tie with efficient movements. "You look fine. I look like I'm pretending to belong here." "Everyone here is pretending something." Her hand stilled on his collar, her gaze lifting to meet his. "The difference is, you're honest about it." They were standing close enough that Ethan could see the fine lines at the corners of her eyes, the slight vulnerability in her expression that she never showed in public. For a moment, the careful distance they'd maintained collapsed, and he was acutely aware of her, not as his employer or his contractual fiancée, but as a woman who was just as uncertain as he was about what they were building. Victoria stepped back abruptly, smoothing her jacket. "The keynote is in 30 minutes. We should go down." The conference hall was a sea of expensive suits and calculating expressions. Ethan stayed close to Victoria as they navigated the crowd, shaking hands, accepting congratulations on their engagement with practiced smiles. He could feel the weight of attention, the subtle assessments being made with every interaction. Robert Chen materialized beside them, his expression neutral but his eyes sharp. "Victoria, Ethan, quite a turnout this year." "The market's been volatile," Victoria replied smoothly. "People want reassurance." "And are you prepared to provide it?" Robert's gaze flickered to Ethan. "There are concerns, questions about whether recent changes in your personal life might be affecting your professional judgment." "My judgment has never been better," Victoria said, her voice cold enough to frost glass. "Our portfolio outperformed the market by 12% last quarter. Client retention is at an all-time high. Perhaps you should be asking whether recent changes have enhanced rather than compromised my effectiveness." "Perhaps," Robert agreed, but his skepticism was palpable. "Though I'm not sure all of our investors will see it that way. David Park has been making some compelling arguments about the need for traditional stability in uncertain times." Ethan's jaw tightened. David Park, still bitter about being contradicted in front of the board, had apparently decided to escalate from passive hostility to active undermining. Before Victoria could respond, a commotion near the entrance drew everyone's attention. A woman in her 50s, impeccably dressed, was making her way through the crowd with the confidence of someone used to rooms parting for her. Ethan recognized her from photos. Catherine Wu, one of the largest independent investors in the tech sector, with enough capital to make or break entire companies. She stopped directly in front of Victoria, ignoring everyone else as if they didn't exist. "Victoria Hale, we need to talk." Victoria's expression remained perfectly composed. "Catherine, it's been too long." "Not long enough, given what I've been hearing." Catherine's gaze swept to Ethan, assessing him with the brutal efficiency of someone who evaluated assets for a living. "So this is the famous Mr. Moore, the secretary who's become indispensable." "Ethan Moore," he said, extending his hand. "And I prefer to think I've become useful rather than indispensable. Indispensable is a dangerous thing to be." Catherine's eyebrows rose fractionally. She shook his hand with a grip that could crush stones. "Interesting answer. Most men in your position would be eager to inflate their importance." "Most men in my position wouldn't be in this position," Ethan replied evenly. "I'm aware of how unusual this situation is. I'm also aware that my value needs to be proven through results, not rhetoric." "Results?" Catherine's smile was sharp. "Let's talk about results then. I'm considering pulling my investment from Hale Industries. $20 million, reallocating to a firm with more traditional management structures?" The threat hung in the air like a blade. $20 million was enough to send shockwaves through the investor community, to trigger doubt and possibly a cascade of withdrawals. Victoria's expression didn't flicker. "That would be unfortunate, Catherine. Though I suspect you didn't come all the way to Portland to tell me something you could have communicated via email. What do you really want? Catherine's smile widened. I want to understand what I'm investing in. The Victoria Hale I've known for 15 years doesn't make impulsive decisions, especially not ones that invite this much scrutiny. So either you've lost your edge or there's something about this situation I'm not seeing. She looked pointedly at Ethan. I want to know which it is. Then join us for dinner tonight, Victoria said without hesitation. Ask whatever questions you need to ask. Evaluate for yourself whether my judgment has faltered or evolved. Catherine considered this, her calculating gaze moving between Victoria and Ethan. Fine, 8 o'clock. But I'm bringing David Park. He's made some interesting observations about recent company decisions that I'd like to explore further. She walked away before Victoria could object, leaving them standing in the middle of the conference hall with the weight of an ambush settling over them like a net. That's going to be fun, Ethan said quietly. Victoria's laugh was devoid of humor. Catherine doesn't do anything without a strategy. She's testing us, seeing if we crack under pressure. And David Park? We'll try to expose you as incompetent or opportunistic, preferably both. Victoria turned to face him fully, her voice dropping lower. Ethan, tonight is going to be brutal. Catherine will ask invasive questions. David will try to humiliate you. They'll both be looking for any sign that this relationship is exactly what the tabloids claim. A transaction dressed up as romance. What do you want me to do? Victoria's expression was fierce. I want you to be exactly who you are. Honest, thoughtful, unafraid to admit what you don't know while defending what you do. Don't try to be someone you're not. That's when they'll smell blood. The keynote speech went smoothly enough. Victoria presenting company performance, outlining future strategies, answering questions with the authoritative precision that had built her reputation. Ethan sat in the front row, aware of eyes on him, whispers rippling through the audience whenever Victoria referenced partnership or collaboration. When she finished to polite applause, David Park immediately requested the microphone for a question. Ms. Hale, you mentioned collaborative decision-making several times in your presentation. Can you clarify the nature of that collaboration? Specifically, what qualifications does Mr. Moore bring to strategic discussions beyond his personal relationship with you? The room went silent. It was a masterful attack, professionally phrased but designed to imply that Ethan's influence was based solely on their engagement, not any actual competence. Victoria's smile was razor-sharp. Mr. Moore brings a perspective that's often lacking in rooms full of people who've never struggled financially, never had to make decisions between basic necessities, never had to understand markets from the position of someone affected by investment decisions rather than profiting from them. That perspective has prevented us from pursuing opportunities that looked excellent on paper but would have failed in practical implementation. It's also identified opportunities that traditional analysis overlooked because they required understanding human behavior rather than just financial modeling. She paused, letting the words settle. As for qualifications, Mr. Moore holds a degree in economics from the University of Washington, which he earned while working full-time and raising a child alone. He's managed complex schedules, budgets, and stakeholder relationships in his role as executive secretary. And he's demonstrated analytical skills that have proven valuable in multiple high-stakes decisions. If you're asking whether he has an MBA from an Ivy League school, the answer is no. If you're asking whether he adds value to our strategic process, the answer is definitively yes. David's expression tightened, but he had no effective response. The message was clear. Victoria wasn't apologizing for Ethan's involvement, and she wasn't going to let it be framed as nepotism when she could point to concrete contributions. But the damage was done. The question had been asked publicly, planting doubt even as Victoria defended against it. Dinner that night was held in a private room at one of Portland's most exclusive restaurants. Ethan arrived early, his stomach churning with anxiety he refused to show on his face. Victoria was already there, reviewing notes, her expression tense. "Whatever happens tonight," she said quietly, "remember that Catherine is looking for weakness. Don't give it to her." Catherine and David arrived precisely at 8, both wearing expressions of polite hostility. They settled into their seats with the air of prosecutors preparing for interrogation. The first course arrived, and with it, Catherine's opening salvo. "So, Ethan," she said, her tone conversational, but her eyes predatory. "Tell me about your background. I understand you were working as a barista before joining Hale Industries." "Among other jobs, yes," Ethan replied calmly. "I worked my way through college, doing whatever paid enough to cover tuition and childcare. Barista, warehouse worker, delivery driver. Whatever was necessary. Must have been difficult raising a child alone while working those jobs." "It was, but it taught me resourcefulness and gave me perspective that formal education can't provide." David leaned forward. "Perspective is valuable, certainly. But wouldn't you agree that major investment decisions require technical expertise and industry experience? Things that can't be learned from, say, working in a warehouse?" Ethan met his gaze steadily. "Technical expertise is essential, absolutely, which is why I defer to Victoria and her team on technical analysis. But technical expertise can miss human factors, how policies affect real people, how market changes impact communities, whether a business model accounts for actual human behavior versus idealized projections." "Can you give an example?" Catherine asked. "The Redmond modular housing investment that David proposed last month," Ethan said, keeping his voice neutral. "The financials looked solid. The founders had impressive credentials. But the timeline didn't account for regulatory realities or community resistance patterns that anyone who's dealt with affordable housing development would recognize immediately. Technical analysis said it was a good investment. Practical experience said it would encounter obstacles that would delay returns by years. And you felt qualified to make that assessment based on what? Living in affordable housing?" David's tone was dismissive. "Based on understanding the systems that technical analysis often treats as negligible variables, permitting processes, union negotiations, community board dynamics. Those aren't footnotes in investment timelines. They're major determinants of success or failure." Ethan paused. "I'm not saying my perspective should override technical expertise. I'm saying it should complement it. Better decisions come from considering multiple angles, not just the ones that fit traditional analytical frameworks." Catherine was watching him with an intensity that felt like being dissected. "Victoria, you've built your reputation on rigorous, data-driven decision-making. How do you reconcile that with incorporating what amounts to anecdotal input from someone without formal training?" Victoria set down her wine glass with deliberate care. "Because data doesn't exist in a vacuum, Catherine. The best analysis in the world fails if it's based on flawed assumptions about human behavior or real-world implementation. Ethan asks questions that my analysts don't think to ask because they've never had to navigate the systems we invest in from the position of someone who lacks power and resources. That's not anecdotal input. That's information that makes our analysis more complete." "Or it's confirmation bias," David suggested, "finding value in input that agrees with your existing preferences." "Funny," Victoria said coolly. "I don't recall Ethan agreeing with me on the Mercer acquisition last week. In fact, he argued quite forcefully against it, which led me to reconsider and ultimately pass on a deal I'd been excited about. Doesn't sound like confirmation bias to me." The dinner continued in this vein for 2 more courses, questions designed to expose, answers calibrated to defend. Ethan felt like he was navigating a minefield where every word could trigger an explosion. Then Catherine shifted tactics, her voice deceptively casual. "Let's talk about your daughter, Ethan. Sophie, isn't it? She must be thrilled about the engagement." Ethan's defenses immediately rose. "She's adjusting well, yes." "It's a lot of change for a 6-year-old. New home, new lifestyle, suddenly living on an estate with staff and security. How do you help her maintain a sense of normalcy?" The question sounded parental, concerned. But Ethan heard the trap, the implication that he was using Sophie, exposing her to instability, prioritizing his own advancement over her well-being. "Sophie's happiness and stability are my first priority," Ethan said firmly. "Always. Every decision I make with her best interests at the center. Yes, our circumstances have changed dramatically, but she has her own space, her own routine, and most importantly, she has certainty that her father is present and devoted to her. That's not something money can buy or change, regardless of where we live." "But surely you worry about what happens if this relationship doesn't work out," David pressed. About the disruption to Sophie's life when she has to adjust again? Ethan's hands tightened on his napkin beneath the table. Every parent worries about their child's well-being, but I don't make decisions based on worst-case scenarios. I make them based on creating the best possible present for her while building toward a stable future. Victoria's voice cut through the tension like a blade. David, your concern for Ethan's parenting is touching, though I notice you don't have children of your own. Perhaps we could focus on questions actually relevant to company performance, rather than attempting to weaponize a 6-year-old girl in your vendetta against decisions that made you look unprepared. David's face flushed red. Catherine's expression remained neutral, but Ethan caught a flicker of something that might have been approval in her eyes. The rest of the dinner was more subdued, the overt attacks replaced by subtle probing. By the time dessert arrived, Ethan felt wrung out, exhausted by the constant vigilance required to defend himself without appearing defensive, to show confidence without arrogance, to prove his worth without overstating it. Catherine stood as coffee was being served, gathering her belongings with efficient movements. Thank you for an illuminating evening, Victoria. Ethan. She paused, her gaze sharp on Ethan's face. You're more substantive than I expected. Whether that's enough remains to be seen. After she and David left, Ethan slumped in his chair, the adrenaline draining away and leaving him hollow. You did well, Victoria said quietly. I felt like I was on trial. You were, and you held your ground. She reached across the table, her hand covering his briefly. Catherine will keep her investment. I'm certain of it. She respects competence, and you demonstrated it tonight. David's going to keep coming. Let him. Every time he attacks you and fails to land a meaningful blow, he weakens his own position. Victoria withdrew her hand, but the warmth of the gesture lingered. Ethan, I need you to understand something. This isn't going to get easier. The more successful we are, the more threatening we become to people invested in maintaining traditional power structures. They'll keep attacking, keep questioning, keep trying to find the crack that brings everything down. I know. Do you? Victoria's voice was intense now, urgent, because there's a difference between knowing intellectually and being prepared emotionally for sustained assault on your character, your competence, your motives. They're going to dig into your past, talk to people you used to know, try to find anything that contradicts the narrative we've built. Ethan met her gaze. There's nothing to find. I've been exactly who I appear to be, a man who's worked hard, raised his daughter, and tried to build something better than what he had. If that's not enough for them, that's their failure, not mine. Something shifted in Victoria's expression. Respect, certainly, but also something deeper, more complicated. You really believe that, don't you? That integrity alone is sufficient defense. Don't you? I used to, she said softly, before I learned that the world doesn't actually reward integrity. It rewards power and the appearance of invulnerability. Then maybe it's time the world learned differently. They sat in the quiet restaurant, the staff discreetly clearing tables around them. And for the first time since this arrangement began, Ethan felt like they were on the same side of something real. Not performing for an audience or fulfilling contract obligations, but genuinely aligned in facing down a world determined to break them. It should have felt strategic, calculated. Instead, it felt like the beginning of something Victoria had warned him against from the start. Actual partnership built on mutual respect and shared purpose. And that, Ethan realized with growing unease, was far more dangerous than any board meeting or investor interrogation could ever be. The danger of something real manifested 2 weeks later in ways Ethan hadn't anticipated. He was working late in his office, reviewing projections for a renewable energy investment Victoria was considering, when his phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Thought you should see this before it goes public tomorrow. A link followed. Ethan clicked it with a sense of foreboding that proved entirely justified. The article was from a prominent business magazine titled The Calculated Rise of Ethan Moore, Ambition or Opportunism. It was a full profile piece, complete with interviews from people Ethan hadn't thought about in years. His old landlord from the apartment complex where he'd lived before the estate, calling him quiet, kept to himself, always seemed like he was planning something. A former coworker from his barista days saying Ethan was smart, maybe too smart for the jobs he was working. You got the sense he was biding his time. Step up, Mookies. The article painted a picture of a man who'd spent years positioning himself for exactly this opportunity, taking the secretary job not out of necessity, but as strategic entry into Victoria's world, cultivating the image of a devoted single father to make himself sympathetic, using his daughter as a prop to soften his ambition's sharp edges. It was character assassination dressed up as investigative journalism, and it was devastatingly effective. Ethan's hands shook as he read. They'd interviewed Sophie's former teacher, who mentioned that Ethan had always been very conscious of appearances, made sure Sophie was well-dressed even when they clearly had limited resources. The observation was twisted to suggest calculation rather than a father's pride in his child. His phone rang. Victoria. "You've seen it," she said. "Just finished reading." "My lawyers are already working on a response. This is actionable, Ethan. Half these quotes are taken out of context, and the implications are defamatory. A response will just give it more attention." Ethan's voice was hollow. "They'll say we're being defensive, that there must be truth to it if we're threatening legal action." Victoria was quiet for a moment. "What do you want to do?" What did he want to do? Ethan looked around his office. The space that 6 months ago he'd been grateful just to occupy, that now felt like evidence of everything the article claimed. He thought about Sophie, asleep in the guest house, who would eventually be old enough to read these articles, to wonder if her father really had used her as a tool for social climbing. "I want to walk away," he said quietly. "From all of it. Before this gets worse." The silence on the other end of the line stretched so long that Ethan thought the call had dropped. Then Victoria's voice, careful and controlled. "Is that what you really want? Or is that what you think you should want?" "Does it matter?" "It matters to me." Ethan closed his eyes, pressing his palm against them until he saw stars. "They're going to keep doing this, Victoria. Every step forward we take, they'll find new ways to tear me down. And eventually, it's going to affect you. Your reputation, your company, your board's confidence. I won't be the reason you lose everything you've built." "Come to the main house," Victoria said. "We need to talk about this in person." She was waiting in her study when Ethan arrived, still dressed in her work clothes despite the late hour. The room was exactly what he'd expected from Victoria. Efficient, elegant, revealing nothing personal except perhaps in its very impersonality. "Sit," she said, gesturing to the leather chair across from her desk. Ethan remained standing. "I've been thinking about the contract terms, the early termination clause. I know there are financial penalties, but—" "Stop." Victoria's voice was sharp. "Just stop. Sit down and listen to me." The command in her tone was impossible to ignore. Ethan sat. Victoria moved from behind her desk, settling into the chair beside his instead of maintaining the power dynamic of the desk between them. It was a small gesture, but it felt significant. "When I proposed this arrangement," she began, "I did it for purely strategic reasons. I needed to change a narrative, shore up board confidence, present a more human face to the public. You needed financial security for your daughter. It was transactional, clean, understandable. I know, that's why—" "I'm not finished." Victoria's gaze was intense. "What I didn't anticipate was that you would be genuinely good at this. Not the performance, though you're excellent at that too, but the substance. You've made me reconsider decisions, question assumptions, see angles I'd been trained to ignore. You've made the company better. You've made me better." Ethan's throat tightened. "That doesn't change what they're saying about me." "No, but it changes what I know to be true." Victoria leaned forward, her voice fierce. "Ethan, I've spent 15 years in this business. I've seen every kind of manipulator, social climber, and opportunist there is. You are none of those things. You're a man who's worked for everything he has, who puts his daughter first in every decision, who has more integrity in his smallest gesture than most of these people have in their entire careers. You can't know that. We barely know each other. I know that you've had multiple opportunities to leverage this relationship for personal gain beyond our agreement, and you haven't taken any of them. I know that you could have sold your story to any number of publications for significant money, and you haven't. I know that when David Park was spreading rumors about you last month, you didn't retaliate or play political games. You just kept doing good work." Victoria stood, pacing now, her carefully controlled composure cracking. "I know that my daughter would be lucky to have someone like you in her life, if I had a daughter. I know that you read to Sophie every night, no matter how late you work. I know that you still budget carefully, even though you don't have to anymore, because that discipline is part of who you are. I know that you're the first person in my life who's ever asked me how I'm actually doing instead of what I need from them. The admission hung in the air between them, raw and unexpected. Ethan stared at her. When did I ask you that? 3 days ago. After the Mercer deal fell through and the board was furious. Everyone else was focused on the financial implications or covering their positions. You knocked on my door at 9 p.m. and asked if I was okay. Victoria's voice had gone soft. Do you know how long it's been since anyone asked me that and actually wanted to hear the answer? Victoria. So no, Ethan, you don't get to walk away because some tabloid journalist with an agenda wrote a hit piece. You don't get to let them win by making you believe their version of who you are. And you definitely don't get to make this decision based on what you think is best for me without actually asking me what I want. Ethan stood as well, needing to move, to think, to process the weight of what Victoria was saying. What do you want? I want you to stay. I want you to keep challenging my assumptions and asking uncomfortable questions and making me see beyond quarterly reports and stock prices. Victoria crossed the space between them, close enough that Ethan could see the vulnerability in her eyes that she usually hid so well. I want to keep having ice cream with you and Sophie. I want to keep feeling like maybe I'm building something real instead of just managing assets. This was supposed to be temporary, Ethan said, his voice rough. A contract with an end date. I know, but somewhere between the engagement party and tonight, it stopped feeling temporary to me. And I think it stopped feeling temporary to you too, or you wouldn't be this torn about leaving. She was right. The realization hit Ethan with the force of truth he'd been avoiding. Somewhere in the last few months, Victoria had stopped being his employer or his contractual fiancée and had become someone he looked forward to seeing, talking to, building something with. The performance had become real, and he'd been too afraid to acknowledge it. I don't know how to do this, he admitted. How to be what you need when half the world is convinced I'm using you. Then we figure it out together. We ignore the noise and focus on the work. We let results speak louder than speculation. Victoria's hand found his, her fingers threading through his with a certainty that made his chest ache. Ethan, I didn't survive in this industry by letting other people's opinions dictate my choices. I'm not about to start now. Your board can deal with it. Catherine Wu called me this afternoon. She's increasing her investment by $15 million. She said she was impressed by what she saw in Portland, by the partnership we've built. Her exact words were, I'm betting on evolution over tradition. Ethan's eyes widened. Catherine's investing more? David Park, on the other hand, is being quietly encouraged to seek opportunities elsewhere. Turns out his due diligence failures extend beyond just the proposals you've questioned. The board is losing confidence in him, not in you. The information was almost too much to process. Ethan had been preparing to walk away, convinced his presence was poison to everything Victoria had built. Instead, she was telling him that their partnership was strengthening the company, that investors were betting on them rather than against them. I don't understand, he said quietly. Why me? You could have chosen anyone for this arrangement, someone with credentials and connections and the right background. Why did you actually choose me? Victoria was quiet for a long moment, her hand still in his. When she spoke, her voice carried a vulnerability he'd never heard before. Because you were invisible, she said. In this company, in this world, you moved through it without expecting anything from it. You didn't see me as a conquest or an opportunity or a means to an end. You just did your job with quiet competence and went home to your daughter. And there was something about that invisibility, that lack of agenda, that felt like the only honest thing in my life. She paused, seeming to gather courage. I thought I could use that honesty as a prop, a performance piece to make me look more human. But what I discovered is that honesty isn't something you can fake. Either you have it or you don't. You have it, Ethan. In everything you do, everything you say, every choice you make. And being around that kind of integrity has made me remember that I used to have it too, before I learned to bury it under strategy and calculation. You still have it, Ethan said. You're one of the most honest people I've ever met. You just express it differently. By threatening legal action and crushing competitors? By refusing to compromise on what you know is right, even when it costs you? By building a company that actually delivers value instead of just extracting it? By telling me the truth about what this arrangement was instead of dressing it up as something romantic? Ethan's thumb traced across her knuckles. That's honesty, Victoria. It just doesn't look the way people expect it to. They stood in the quiet study, the city lights visible through the window behind them, and something fundamental shifted. The contract that had brought them together, the careful terms and financial arrangements and time limits, felt suddenly irrelevant compared to what had grown in its shadow. So what do we do now? Ethan asked. Victoria's smile was small but genuine. We stop performing for everyone else and start being honest with ourselves about what this has become. Victoria's free hand came up to cup his face, her touch gentle despite the steel in her voice. Ethan, I'm not asking you to declare love or make promises about forever. I'm just asking you to stay. To keep being the person who makes me laugh at 10 p.m. when I'm drowning in reports. To keep asking Sophie about her day and reading her bedtime stories and showing her that good men actually exist. To keep challenging me to be better than my own worst instincts. Ethan closed his eyes, leaning into her touch. Every logical part of his brain was screaming that this was complicated, that mixing real feelings with contractual obligations was dangerous, that he should walk away while he still could. But the part of him that had learned to trust instinct over logic, that had survived years of impossible choices by listening to what felt true rather than what made sense, that part knew Victoria was right. This had become real, messy, and imperfect, and terrifying in its reality, but real nonetheless. Okay, he said quietly. I'll stay. The relief that flooded Victoria's expression was so profound it made Ethan's chest ache. She pulled him into a hug that started awkward and hesitant, but quickly became something fierce and grounding, both of them holding on to something they weren't quite ready to name but couldn't deny. When they finally pulled apart, Victoria's eyes were suspiciously bright. You should know, I'm terrible at this, at relationships and vulnerability and all the things that apparently make people happy in partnerships. Lucky for you, I'm not much better. We can be terrible at it together. That's probably the worst foundation for a relationship I've ever heard. Good thing we're not most people, then. The next morning, the article was everywhere. Ethan's phone exploded with messages from people he hadn't heard from in years, some supportive, many not, all wanting to weigh in on his supposed calculated rise to power. His email was flooded with interview requests from journalists who smelled blood in the water. He ignored all of it and went to work. The office was different now, though. People who'd been friendly before were suddenly distant, conversation stopping when he approached. Danielle looked at him with something that might have been pity or might have been disappointment. He couldn't quite tell. He was getting coffee in the break room when he overheard two junior analysts talking in voices they clearly thought were quieter than they were. Can't believe he's still showing his face. What else is he going to do? He's locked in now. No way Victoria can break it off without looking like she made a terrible judgment call. Feel bad for the kid, honestly, growing up watching her dad work the system like that. Ethan's hand tightened on his coffee cup hard enough that he was surprised it didn't shatter. He turned to face them, and both analysts went pale when they realized he'd heard every word. You're right, he said quietly. You should feel bad for Sophie. Not because of anything I've done, but because she's growing up in a world where people will judge her father without knowing him, reduce his choices to caricature, and assume the worst because it makes a better story than the truth. He walked out before they could respond, his heart hammering, but his head high. Victoria was waiting in his office, which was unusual. She normally summoned him to hers. I heard about the break room, she said. News travels fast. It always does. Ethan, I want to make a statement. Public, unambiguous, defending you and our relationship. That'll just add fuel to the fire. Then let it burn. I'm tired of watching you absorb attacks in silence while trying to protect me and the company. It's not fair, and it's not necessary. Ethan set down his coffee, studying her. Victoria looked fierce and certain, every inch the powerful executive who'd built an empire through force of will. But he could also see the concern in her eyes, the protectiveness that made his chest warm despite his frustration with the situation. What would this statement say? that you're an invaluable part of our strategic team, that our relationship began professionally and evolved naturally, that anyone questioning your competence or character is invited to examine our actual results rather than trafficking in speculation. Victoria's voice was firm, and that I'm proud to have you as my partner in every sense of the word. The last sentence landed like a stone in still water, ripples spreading outward from the impact. Every sense? Ethan repeated carefully. I meant what I said last night. This isn't performance anymore, Ethan. Not for me. If we're going to face this scrutiny, we should face it honestly, together. Before Ethan could respond, his phone rang. Sophie's school, the caller ID said. His heart immediately jumped to worst-case scenarios. This is Ethan Moore. Mr. Moore, this is Principal Richardson. I'm afraid we have a situation. Sophie became very upset during recess and locked herself in the bathroom. She won't come out, and she's asking for you. Ethan was already grabbing his jacket. I'm on my way. He made it to the school in record time, Victoria's words about making a public statement forgotten in the immediate crisis of his daughter's distress. Principal Richardson met him at the entrance, her expression grave. What happened? Ethan demanded. Another child brought in a tablet. They were looking at news articles during recess, which is absolutely against policy, and we're addressing that separately. But Sophie saw the article about you, about your relationship with Ms. Hale. Ethan's blood ran cold. They showed her that article? I don't think it was intentional. The children were just scrolling, and Sophie's name was mentioned. She saw it and became very distressed. Ethan didn't wait for more explanation. He headed straight for the girls' bathroom, knocking gently on the door. Sophie? Baby? It's Daddy. Can you let me in? Silence. Then, small and broken. They said you're bad, Daddy. They said you're using Victoria and using me to get money. The words were a knife to his heart. Ethan pressed his forehead against the door, fighting to keep his voice steady. Can you open the door so we can talk about this? Please, Sophie, I need to see that you're okay. The lock clicked. The door opened a crack. Sophie's tear-stained face appeared, and Ethan's heart broke all over again. He pushed into the bathroom, breaking about 17 school policies, probably, but he didn't care, and knelt down to pull his daughter into his arms. I'm not bad, he said fiercely, and I'm not using anyone. Do you believe me? Sophie nodded against his chest, but her grip on him was desperate. Then why did the article say those things? How did you explain adult cruelty to a 6-year-old? How did you make her understand that sometimes people needed villains, needed someone to tear down, needed to believe the worst because it made them feel better about their own choices? Because sometimes people don't understand things that are different from what they expect, Ethan said carefully. They see a secretary marrying his boss, and they think they know the whole story. But they don't know us, Sophie. They don't know that Victoria makes you laugh, or that she taught you to identify birds by their calls, or that she sits with you while you do homework even though she has a million other things she could be doing. She does that because she likes me, right? Not because you told her to? She does that because she genuinely cares about you, about us. That's the truth, baby. The article is just guessing. We know what's real. Sophie pulled back to look at him, her eyes red and puffy. Emma said her mom said you're a gold digger. What's a gold digger? Ethan wanted to have some very choice words with Emma's mother, but he focused on his daughter. It's what people call someone they think is only interested in money. But here's what matters, Sophie. I don't need other people to believe in me. I just need you to. Can you do that? Sophie nodded slowly. I believe in you, Daddy. You're the best person I know. The simple faith in her voice undid something in Ethan. He pulled her close again, breathing in her strawberry shampoo smell, feeling the weight of her trust like both a gift and a responsibility. We're going home, he said. You've had enough school for today. Principal Richardson tried to protest, citing attendance policies and the importance of not rewarding distress with avoidance. But one look at Ethan's face and she wisely backed down. He drove Sophie back to the estate in silence, letting her process, giving her space to feel whatever she needed to feel. When they pulled through the gates, Sophie looked up at the main house with an expression Ethan couldn't quite read. Is Victoria home? She asked. Probably. She usually works from home in the afternoons. Why? I want to talk to her. Ethan's surprise must have shown on his face because Sophie added, "Please, Daddy, I need to ask her something." They found Victoria in her study, exactly where Ethan had expected. She looked up when they entered, her expression shifting immediately from focused concentration to concern when she saw Sophie's tear-stained face. "What happened?" she asked, already standing. Sophie walked straight to her, none of her usual shyness with adults evident. "Do you like my daddy?" Victoria blinked, clearly not expecting that question. "Yes, Sophie, very much. Not because of his job or because he works for you, but because of who he is." Understanding dawned in Victoria's expression. She knelt down so she was at Sophie's eye level, giving the question the seriousness it deserved. "Your father is one of the kindest, smartest, most honest people I've ever met. He makes me laugh when I'm stressed. He challenges me to be better when I'm being lazy in my thinking. He sees people, really sees them, in a way most people don't. That has nothing to do with his job and everything to do with who he is. And you're not pretending to like us?" Victoria's gaze flicked to Ethan, something vulnerable in her expression. "I'm not pretending, Sophie, I promise you that." Sophie studied her with the intensity of a child trying to determine truth from lie. Then she threw her arms around Victoria's neck